Anselm and Aquinas are two towering medieval thinkers, both of them Christian thinkers, both of them extraordinary logicians and capable of astounding mental feats. First, we will think very briefly about Anselm. He was a monk. He was from Canterbury, and he's especially famous for one thing in particular, and that is an argument for God's existence. It looks like a verbal sleight of hand at first, but many have found it to be a convincing argument. It is the ontological argument. And Anselm's ideas based on this argument ultimately advanced Augustine's thinking on a variety of topics. But for the argument itself, I'm going to go ahead and read these premises out loud, and it's difficult stuff, so we'll try to think through them quickly together. So it is a conceptual truth, or true by definition, that God is a being than which none greater can be imagined. It is the greatest possible being that God can be imagined, And then also God exists as an idea in the mind, or one can imagine an idea of God. A being that exists as an idea in the mind and in reality is, other things being equal, greater than a being that exists only as an idea in the mind. Let me come back to that premise in just a minute. Thus, if God exists only as an idea in the mind, then we can imagine something that is greater than God, that is the greatest possible being that does exist. But we cannot imagine something that is greater than God, for it is a contradiction to suppose that we can imagine a being greater than that, which is the greatest possible being that can be imagined. So God must exist. Apart from the question of whether we can in fact have a conception of God, God being an idea in the mind, I want to focus in on this third premise, this idea that a being that exists as an idea in the mind and in reality is, other things being equal, greater than a being that exists only as an idea in the mind. So I take it that there are all sorts of real horses that really exist, that gallop, that trot, that eat hay, that eat carrots. And then there's Pegasus. Pegasus doesn't exist. Pegasus is a winged horse, and in that sense Pegasus is a very great horse. Pegasus has a great making property, the property of being a winged horse. And yet in comparison to the horses that do exist, Pegasus is less than they are, because Pegasus is merely an idea in the mind. Real existence is a great making property. Other things being equal, something that has real existence is greater than something that exists in the mind alone. And so when real horses don't have wings but do have real existence, they are greater than Pegasus. And Pegasus is merely a figment of our imaginations, and in that sense is a lesser thing. So the idea is that God has to exist. If God did not exist, then those things that do exist in the real world, those things that have real existence, would be greater than God. They would have real existence that is superior to that of God, if God were only a figment of our imaginations, only a mind. So God must, only a mental idea. So God must have real existence. God must really be a thing. This doesn't say as an argument anything about God's nature. It simply says that God must exist. Moving on to Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is perhaps the greatest thinker in Christian history. He was a medieval monk. He was a Dominican, and famously he spent his life's intellectual project, he spent his time combining Aristotelian structures or categories with Christian theological commitments. So he takes Aristotle's ideas brought back from the Crusades, where they had been preserved in the Islamic world, and he unites these ideas with Christian theological commitments. His great works are the Summa Theologiae and the Summa Contra Gentiles, and his style in these works is famously lawyerly. He has a very exacting, careful style where he employs objections and responds to the objections and develops his ideas in a point by counterpoint, punch counter punch sort of a move. Aquinas famously in the in the Summa Theologiae, also in the Summa Contra Gentiles, argues for God's existence. And he does this using 5 arguments, or the famous Cinque Vivae in Latin. Aquinas wrote in Latin. The Cinque Vivae, or the 5 ways, are 5 different approaches to proving God's existence. One way is an argument for motion. This is just a straightforward cosmological argument. So let me go ahead and read these premises. 1. Our senses prove that some things are in motion. Things move when potential motion becomes actual motion. Only an actual motion can convert a potential motion into an actual motion. Nothing can be at once in both actuality and potentiality in the same respect. Therefore, nothing can move itself. Therefore, each thing in motion is moved by something else. The sequence of motion cannot extend ad infinitum. Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover, put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. Okay, so this is technical language, but at the heart of this is just a very simple original idea. And the idea is that there must be a first thing. If you think of this argument in terms of causes and not in terms of motion, the idea is very intuitive. Everything comes into being because of a cause. Something caused it or brought it into being. So the tree is the result of the acorn is the result of another tree. That other tree resulted from an acorn, and so on. I am the result of my parents. They are the result of their parents, the result of parents before them, and so on, all the way back to the beginning for Aquinas. Now there are 2 potential things that could stop the train of causes. One is God, or a first thing, Aquinas would say. And the other is actually that the train of causes does not officially stop. It's just a train of causes that goes back to infinity. For Aquinas, the answer is God, and he argues for it in this way. Whenever something undergoes motion, it has to do so because it is caused to do so by something. Nothing can be the cause of its own motion, since something cannot have a quality both potentially and actually at the same time. Whenever something moves, this motion must have been brought about by something other than that thing. The chain connecting things that move cannot be infinite, therefore there is a first mover which initiates motion but is not itself moved. So God, famously on this view of things, is an unmoved mover, or a primum mobile. This sort of an argument for God's existence doesn't say anything about who or what God is, but it does say something about God's existence, there being a first thing. It doesn't necessarily argue that God is an intelligent being, but it does say that God is the first thing. And there are arguments against the cosmological argument. So it could just be causes all the way back, or movers all the way back, and there really is no first thing. The universe itself could be infinite in its history. Aquinas has some arguments against this. He thinks that it involves seeing the universe as infinite involves making various category mistakes, including predicating attributes or qualities of intermediate movers to a set as a whole, when the set as a whole is an infinite thing, among various other difficulties. So there are some worries too that need to be referenced. One concern is whether the first mover is a unique thing. So there's nothing in the argument that establishes that the first mover is one thing. It could be a polytheist. That could be the origin of things. Some say it is not impossible to have an infinite chain of motions. Still others focus on the question of whether an infinite chain in fact is an actual thing. Aquinas has several other arguments for God's existence. Here we'll focus on just one other, the 5th way. This is the teleological argument, or the argument from purpose or design. Telos just means goal. It's the Greek word for end or goal. And the premises and conclusion are as follows. We see that natural bodies work towards some goal and do not do so by chance. Most natural things lack knowledge. But as an arrow reaches its target because it is directed by an archer, what lacks intelligence achieves goals by being directed by something intelligent. Therefore, conclusion, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. So this is another very famous argument. And in layman's speak, it just is this. When we look around us and we see the world, it is evident that things are very complex. And whenever we encounter complexity, it is almost always the case, in fact, perhaps always the case, depending on the level of complexity, that we see intelligence behind the complexity. Okay, so if you encounter an iPhone, then it stands to reason that there must be an intelligent being behind this smartphone, an intelligent source of it. And so Aquinas is saying when we see the natural world, when we look around us at the natural world and at its objects, many of them are incredibly extraordinarily complex. So it stands to reason that there would be an intelligent source for these complexities. If you think of it in contemporary vernacular, if one thinks of the deliverances of physics, especially at the microparticle level, many of them are extraordinarily complex and required an extraordinary amount of fine-tuning, which is just technical speak for the idea that they're very improbable kinds of results. And so it stands to reason that there would be an intelligent source behind this. Some have argued against the teleological argument. Okay, so as with the cosmological argument, there's a concern here about uniqueness too. Aquinas concludes that there is an intelligent being who directs all natural things to their ends, but there's nothing in the argument that entails singularity for this being. There might be many different beings. It could be a polytheist origin. Okay, another concern might be the presence of dysteleology, or the non-functional or dysfunctional or suboptimal features of the universe and the things it contains. Okay, so there are various things about the world that suggest that it might not be a product of purpose, or might not be oriented toward a purpose or have functionality, like the existence of evil, for instance. Others would argue that it is possible for complexity to arise out of non-complex sources. So maybe evolution, if it is an unguided process, has resulted in complex beings, but it is not itself a result of a complex design. It simply is a period of time and chance operating upon in a particular environment, upon particular species, producing speciation and various different adaptations over time, so that there is descent with modification. Many think that Darwinian natural selection is a sort of a natural ratchet system whereby it's possible mindlessly by incremental steps to arrive at something that appears, when looked at in retrospect, to have been an incredibly complex thing resulting from design. A couple of questions that can be asked about a natural ratchet system are as follows. Even if there were such a natural ratchet system and it were sufficient to produce the instances of apparent design we observe in the biological realm, could this natural ratchet system itself have been put in place for the purpose of generating the biological complexity we observe? And this seems to be intuitive. And then also, granted that natural selection takes place among biological organisms, is this natural process sufficient to explain all the complexity we observe? And here Aquinas would argue, and I myself find this argument to be very convincing, this teleological argument. Aquinas himself would argue that an unguided process is not in fact sufficient to explain many of the complexities that we observe in the natural world. For instance, consciousness. Consciousness is very difficult to trace, evolutionarily speaking, to some particular set of steps or vestigial organs or some other sort of a halfway point. And when it comes to something difficult like this, there are other instances of this as well that one can find in the evolutionary process. When it comes to things such as these, one must ask whether it is implausible to attribute a full causal explanation to an unguided evolutionary process, and whether or not it's more plausible, in fact, to attributes the causal explanation for the world and its complexity to an intelligent designer using evolutionary processes or using some other means to bring these things about in the world.